Hi, everyone. My name is Ale. I am a third-year grad student in cell bio and also part of SPEAR. Thank you for those of you who are joining us for the second session. I hope the first session was helpful and a good setup for today's activities. Today, we are happy to welcome Dr. Adriana Bankston. Dr. Adriana is the Principal Legislative Analyst at the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations. She also serves as Chief Outreach Officer at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, co-director of the Policy Task Force at Future of Research, and biomedical workforce and policy research investigator at the STEM Advocacy Institute. Recently, Anam and I have had the pleasure of having her as an instructor for the past few months while taking a science policy certificate course offered by UC Irvine. She has a wealth of knowledge, and we hope that you enjoy learning from her. So Adriana, if you want to take it away.
Great, thank you. Let's do this. Right. Great, so thanks for having me here. I always enjoy talking to students who are interested in policy careers, so it's fun to talk to this group. So I heard that you already know a little bit about the basics, so I won't go through sort of what I normally give about policy, but hopefully more practical skills today that you can take away from this. So before I start, I just have to say that my presentation is my personal views and does not represent the views of University of California. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I thought we'd start a little bit with a bit of intro about me, and then talk about how do you communicate science policy, what does that mean in terms of non-scientists, what does it mean to advocate to legislators, and then go through our two sections, elevator pitch. So I will ask you to think about topics that you might be interested in speaking on or writing on through an Excel sheet that we'll share. Talk about the Onepager a little bit, what it is, and then have you practice for hopefully about 30 minutes or less, maybe less than that, into either the elevator pitch or the Onepager, and then we'll come back and recap what you learned. So my path from academia to policy, without getting really deeply into it, I just want to sort of show you this to give you some ideas of how you might transition, but also things that you want to think about in this process. So I was pretty much a typical academic. Got my bachelor's from Clemson, I got my PhD from Emory, did a postdoc. During my postdoc, started thinking about what other options there might be, and started organizing some programming for students and postdocs like you guys are doing here to think about different career options, and got really interested in training, which I guess sort of led eventually down to this class that we just taught this year. And so in there I was organizing seminar to bring speakers to talk about careers. I got involved in organizations that were thinking of sort of working on this training space, and then also engaged in local policy, again, not knowing a whole lot about policy at the time yet. And then I got involved with two nonprofits that were really sort of instrumental in this transition. One is Future of Research, you might have heard about. So we do this through symposia, trying to get advice or sort of ask grad students what issues they're going through, and then also published paper and postdoc salaries. And this is sort of the connection between academia and policy, which then extended into my next role, as Ali mentioned, with JSPG, where I do outreach. So JSPG is a nonprofit and also an open access journal that publishes early career work in policy. And so we try to elevate the voices of young scientists in science policy through the journal and other activities. And afterwards, I started sort of delving more deeply into policy, joined different organizations and committees, and had different roles. So I wouldn't go into this. So happy to chat with you later if you want. The idea being that you're sort of immersing yourself more into this this world that you want to go into, and volunteering in different committees, etc. And then these are sort of my two major activities, I guess. So my real sort of bridge into policy was through a policy and advocacy fellowship with Society for Neuroscience, where the major thing was a Capitol Hill Day. So if you've never done a Hill Day, it's highly recommended. It's where you would advocate for a specific issue as part of a group or a society or organization. It's a really great experience. And I'm bringing this up because Hill Day and this sort of relationship building is a big part of this world and this policy space that you need to know how to do. And the other thing I did here was contribute to the advocacy newsletter, which is, again, keeping tabs on a lot of national policy, how SFN members are doing policy, et cetera. And again, here writing is a big part of this, this job. And the transition that into my current role, where again, I sort of do that same thing. So we advocate on behalf of the University of California and a lot of university issues generally, again, through Capitol Hill briefings, which is, again, a lot of this is built on sort of people relationships and maintaining those relationships over time, which is where this communication comes in. Research advocacy, so we advocate for a lot of issues that are within the system and in universities generally, as well as interplay with federal agencies. So just bringing this up to sort of lay the field here that a lot of what we're going to talk about today has been helpful throughout the process, and you would really use that in policy. So takeaways from this section, a lot of these things that I was sort of reflecting back on all these experiences, there are some common things that have come out of this. So a lot of what I've done has been very sort of proactive and, you know, volunteering on committees and sort of putting myself out there and saying, okay, I'm interested in this. How can I volunteer? How can I run for this position, et cetera. So that sort of proactiveness really helps. As well as professionalism and teamwork. So obviously these are things that I deal with now. So I'm the only science PhD in my office. And so it's interesting to interact with different individuals from different backgrounds. And the things that you're bringing here, obviously you're being organized and sort of working on your own professional development. And so I think what we're doing today and these sorts of meetings can help you hone your policy skills better because you're taking this step forward to work on your policy expertise. And the things that this is basically what I still do now. A lot of data analysis, thinking about how you're translating your science to policymakers is pretty much, especially in the government relations role, a lot of this is translating the research that happens on campus to policymakers and vice versa, as well as advocacy and relationship building. So as I said, a lot of this happens on the Hill, but you maintain this also during the year, which is why you need to know how to do an elevator pitch, as well as the one-pagers that we'll talk about. And policy research and writing is, as I mentioned, a lot of this is research, and you need to be able to write about research or scientific topics in different formats. So with that, now hopefully I sort of given you an idea of why we're talking about this and why it's important. So how do you actually communicate science policy, right? So you've probably seen this before. As a scientist, you're probably used to the structure where you start with your background, supporting details, and results in conclusions. So when you're talking to non-scientific audiences, it's sort of flipped around, where you start with the bottom line first. You want to convince them and say, why do I care? Why are you telling me this? And then fill it in with more details and then have a call to action at the end. So keeping this in mind, as we'll be doing this during the breakouts of the exercise, but this is something to think about as you're in science policy overall. So the other thing to remember is that your message is very specific to who you're talking to. So in this case, it would be a specific legislator. Obviously you would be talking to policymakers. The way that you talk and what you say depends also on what their background is and what they might be interested in as related to the issue. So what is the message that you want to convey to your specific audience? So that's important to consider, that not all policymakers are the same, and knowing the background is important. So just a few principles for communication. So we're going to use active verbs, which is sort of conveys leadership, and not use jargon. So this is something I think that's probably one of the hardest things for scientists to learn, how to talk in very broad terms to somebody that is not a scientist and needs to understand this. And I'll say that a lot of, probably most policymakers don't have a science background. And then the other thing is you want to include details that are critical to your message, but not everything. So I think we have the tendency to sort of include everything that we can think of, and it's very important to just keep to what they need to know. Also because policymakers are busy, they really don't have time to read a lot, which is why a lot of these policy write-ups and pitches are really short and to the point because they don't have time to listen to a long message. And then, as I said, tailor to your audience. So again, what you're going to say depends on, again, what they're interested in as well. And then you want to start with the ask and what you want them to do, and then build on that. So how do you build the argument? So this is going to apply to both the elevator pitch and the one-pager, really anything that you're doing. In policy, a lot of it comes down to trying to convince somebody of something that you want them to do. So things to consider is who you're writing this as. So why are you interested in this topic? Who are you writing it? Is it as you? Is it as your university? Is it as your state? Sort of what scope you're representing when you're writing this. In the context, again, you need to understand what prior legislation and other things have happened on this topic. So you may have a good idea, but you want to make sure that hasn't been done already. If you're asking for funding, which a lot of advocacy is, you want to think about how you want the funding to be allocated, even if they don't ask, but you want to sort of think a step forward and say, okay, if I'm asking you for $2 billion, how do you want me to use that, and have that ready. In the political context, obviously, as I said, some of this is going to depend on what's going on federally. Each stakeholder, each representative will have sort of their own opinions on issues, so it's important to know what that is and how the policy or the argument that you have is going to affect them as far as will they agree, will it mean they have to spend more money, will it mean different financial burden or administrative burden, and there's a lot of considerations that go into crafting good policies. So this is sort of what a structure would look like, again, which applies to both of the things we're doing today. You want to start with the takeaway, what you want them to take away from this, and then build, as I said, the background and significance, sort of broader significance of the work, building the argument and different dimensions that go into play here, and then have recommendations, again, what is it that you want them to take away from this? And the blueprint being that, even if it's not necessarily in the original sort of first document, you want to have an idea of how you might implement the recommendations that you're coming to them with, because they might ask you that, and it's good to think ahead. So, so this is sort of general communication and the way to structure this. Now, how do you actually advocate to legislators? So now that if you have your message, you have your pitch, then what do you do? So advocacy is defined as advancing social causes or policy recommendations through public education, grassroots organization, and lobbying. Most goals of advocacy are to do some sort of change, right? So social change, institutional change. If you're advocating for institutions, you want to persuade policymakers to do something, or you want to change public opinion on a specific topic. And advocacy is most often effective through having talking points. So this is where the one-pager comes in. You want to have a guide when you go to talk to them on Capitol Hill as to what you're thinking, again, what you want them to do and what the outcomes might be. A lot of advocacy involves creating materials before going. So, a lot of times meetings with legislators are very short. I would say maybe 20 minutes on average. And that obviously doesn't happen that often. So you really have to take advantage of the time that you have with them because, and sort of maximize that. So that means preparing a lot ahead of time in terms of materials that you have. A lot of times you sort of leave it leave it with their office, and then come back and talk again, etc. So it's important that these are very clear and prepared ahead of time. And you will, if you meet with them, again, you want to have sort of an argument of what you're talking about and why they should care. So some different ways to do advocacy. So what people usually say is that advocacy takes as much time as you have. So really any of these things counts. If you have a few minutes, you can do a phone call to your representatives, do a tweet, a Facebook post. These things are significant. A lot of times legislators and their staff will be on social media. They'll tweet about what they're doing as well. So you can see that. Writing a letter or an OPED, again, we could talk about writing for a long time, but this is very effective, especially if you can publish in places where they can read them. And local meetings. So one way is to consider what advocacy you might be able to do locally in your state if you're not in DC. If you have a longer full day, so I guess this is less applicable now, but you could still do virtual lab tours. So they love to see what research is going on in their district. If you can, get them to come to your lab to see what you're doing. A local official's office, again, a lot of this, there is obviously a lot of virtual advocacy now, as well as local advocacy during the year. If you can't come to DC, obviously a lot of it happens here. This doesn't really apply to you, but starting a local science policy and advocacy group, so you all have this already here. I encourage you to take advantage of this. This is also a good way for institutions that don't have this to build some leadership experience and be proactive in this space. So a lot of people who start in policy actually do that through starting a policy group. And then more in depth, so what I sort of described is what I have done. Capitol Hill days, working on legislation, writing congressional testimony, as well as responses to what different agencies are asking for. So a lot of times there'll be questions, sort of responses from the community to specific topics. And these things you would likely do through a scientific society or maybe your institution in more organized ways, but it's definitely a good thing to do if you have the time and opportunity. So now let's go to talk about the elevator pitch. So as most of advocacy, elevator pitches are meant to persuade something, right? So you're going to communicate the relevance of your work to the policymaker and the benefits to society. So you really want to think much broader than the project that you're working on. You want it to be persuasive, again, understanding what the background is and convincing them of something you want them to do. Most of the time this will happen in the legislator's office. However, it can also happen in networking events and really anywhere. So this is what I tell people. Sometimes random things happen even in DC. You might actually run to your legislator somewhere in town. And so you really always want to have this message on hand, because you never know where people are who might be influenced by what you're saying just through a casual conversation. And a lot of this, again, what happens in DC is very sort of relationship-based, conversational. And so it's not just happening in that sort of where you would think that it's happening on the Hill, because it can really happen anywhere. And so in terms of principles, you want to think about the sort of the hook, right? So when they basically, you're gonna sort of hook them in the first 30 seconds as to why they're gonna care. So if you start saying like, I'm so-and-so, I work on this, they're probably not gonna care. They want to see like, why are you telling me this? So tell me that first. So why is this important in a broad sense? If you can hook them with something broad that they can agree with, like, okay, the situation isn't good, whatever is something that is universally happening or people can agree on, is something that they're gonna relate to, and then you can start going through your story. A lot of them will be responsive to data, not all of them. So some legislators are more interested in your story. Why are you talking about this? So there is a mix of also understanding what their motivation is for listening to you. Some of them will be, again, very interested in data. Other ones will not be. So that's why doing your research on how they work and what they're interested in is important. And then you want to connect with them sort of right off the bat, again, something broad. You want them to remember something that you're saying, right? So think about what do you want them to remember from your pitch, and you want them to be able to repeat it back to you, basically. So this is something that you've learned recently, that it's not just like you're sort of talking to them and here's all the information. It really should be a conversation that goes back and forth that can end with a call to action. It usually is something you want them to do. But at the same time, it should be easy enough that they can repeat it back to you and understand, oh, okay, I understand this is what you're telling me to do. So it's very much back and forth and high level, if you think about it that way. So just to reiterate this again, questions when you're working on your pitch, thinking about, is there something that you want them to remember and see a certain image about what you're saying? What is it you want them to remember when you're done? And so they could tell someone else about it. And what is the call to action that you want them to take away? So a lot of times we maybe get lost in this discussion of our research, but remember that the whole goal is to persuade them to do something. And so you want to have a call to action at the end. And as I said, you want to make it feel like a conversation. It's important to think about both craft and delivery. So craft is, I'll show you in a second, again, the structure, but also the delivery and how you're sort of presenting yourself and targeting to a specific policymaker, again, and what they will care about. And showing your passion and interest goes a long way. So I think that makes a big difference when you could have two different people talk about the same issue, but when you're really passionate and that shows, they'll respond to that. So the structure itself is sort of, you want to get their attention first. You want to say, establish a need or a problem that you want to solve. Come up with a solution and say, our group is doing this. Here's how we're doing it. And think about what would happen if the outcome did happen or it didn't, right? So if you're trying to convince them of something, then you want to present the positive outcomes of that, and then give a call to action at the end. But also think about the counter arguments, right? Because a lot of times you might get that idea of why do I care, or they may have sort of bring up other things that you didn't think about. It's good to consider both sides of the story, even if you're just advocating for one side. So here's one sort of simple way to think about this. You would say, I want you to do something specific. I'll give you a reason for you to care based on what you find is important. Again, knowing what they are interested in, and then go into your work. I'll say briefly how my work supports this issue, and then conclude by telling you what happens if you do the thing I'm asking you to do. So you're asking them to do something, and then say what the consequence of that is, why that's important for not just for them, but for society overall. So here's an example. This is good. It's from an MIT communication lab. So this is a good link to check out. Would be sort of the structure of something that talks about a nuclear regulatory commission, needs to begin developing regulations to govern the operation of the next generation of nuclear power plants. So this is sort of setting the stage if you're going to talk about power plants, and why should they care about the governance of the power plants? Because they can provide carbon-free energy, which is going to be able to address climate change. And then you can go into how does your research support this? The problem is that right now, nobody has really thought about safety and licensing of these power plants. Here's what my research has done. We've developed tools, et cetera, to work on this process. And the final part is, here's what we need you to do. We need you to work on this now so that we can build operating and safe advanced nuclear power plants in the next decade. So it's a pretty simple process. You can see it's very high level. There's no jargon here. It's very kind of high level thinking about what is the societal value of this, what will happen if it doesn't work, right? If they don't do what you say, so that's implicit from this, and why they need to do what you're saying, right? So what will happen if they act on this? So this is a pretty straightforward structure. I think I'm gonna pause here and have you think a little bit about the topics that you might be interested in before we go on to the actual exercise. I'm gonna stop sharing, see if I can share this link with you. Oops. So I've put in the chat an Excel sheet. If you can just go through and write down something that you would want to do your pitch on in your Onepager, doesn't have to be the same, just to get an idea of what you're thinking of. It doesn't have to be a research, just something that you care about that you'd want them to act on. And here I've also put legislator, so this is not something you have to fill out now, but something to keep in mind as you're working on your pitch, who it might be directed to. So I'll give you a few minutes for that. Okay, looks like most of you have filled this in. Anyone else who hasn't done it yet? Oh, there we go, still working, okay. Great, okay. So one purpose of this is so you can see the breadth of topics. So it's nice to see that. Okay, so one is about non-floodplain wetlands, affordable housing, student visa. So there's a couple of university advocacy here. Diversity and postdoc position, yeah. So it seems like it's sort of climate, environment kind of questions. Sustainability is an important question, yeah. Okay, so keep this in mind. I will keep going and you can keep working on this. Let me share again. So I want to then just tell you a little bit of the one-pagers as well, because it's sort of similar, and you would think about this similarly as you would for elevator pitch. So the one-pager, as I said, is something that you would give to policymakers when you go to their office to summarize the issue, present an argument. And you would essentially leave this with their office to remember that you were there and read later as well. Most of the time it'll be their staff. And then it should be really clear and understandable. So as I mentioned, they don't have a whole lot of time to read this. It should be something that within, I would say, 30 seconds, they can understand what you're asking for and what you want them to do with the document that you leave behind. And it's actually called leave behind document. So the structure here, so it's similar to the elevator pitch in the sense you start with the ask, and this is again one page indicated here about. Obviously, the first part is just 1 to 2 sentences of what the ask is. You want to be specific and tell them how they can help and how they can support the cause. So, and I'll show you an example. But it should be very specific, and that you would say, we are asking for I don't know, $2 billion to support education at UGA. We're asking for new legislation on climate change or sustainability or other things that you wrote in there. So this is important for them to know what you're asking for and how that may be done. A lot of times it's financial, not always. Sometimes it's a bill, an additional program or something else they can do to enhance the education, for example. The relevant background, so this will be about 1/3 of the page. Again, why they should care. There should be some data here. Thinking about the angle of the argument. So again, this is going to depend on what it is and what effect it has. So one example is economic, right? So for training, developing new programs to train postdocs, that's going to have a good consequence on the economy, for example. And you want it to be very visually appealing with bullet points, charts, bars, graphs, etc. So not a lot of text. Again, they won't have time to read. They should be able to just understand quickly what you're saying. And the analysis is sort of, again, there's different ways of going about this and different outcomes of what you're asking for. So you want to think about why the recommendation that you have is the best course of action among all the other options. And also aligning your interests with those of the policymakers. Again, some of this is going to depend on knowing who to go to and doing your research, and not everyone will agree. Sometimes you'll have a new legislator that you're trying to convince to support your organization. Maybe they're new to office, you're going to talk to them. So it's important to know, again, what they're interested in and like who, and also who might align, right? So they're representatives who have supported this cause potentially for the past 10 years, and so who those people are and going to them. It's important. But at the same time, you want to remain objective and again, understand the both sides of the issue. And people often ask, is there a standard? So not technically, as long as you follow this format, you want to keep it simple, visually appealing. The language should be clear, easily digestible, and something they can read quickly and understand. So here's one example, Parents for Lunch, representing 500 local families. So this is very clear. As you can see, obviously there's kids in the picture, there's food. The The font is very obvious. What do you want it to do? Keep our kids fed, vote yes on the school lunch amendment. So this is very simple. What is the ask? How they're going to do it? They're going to vote. What kind of data exists to back this up? Again, build the argument from the top. Over 70% of students rely on this. Increases their health. They behave better. They get better grades. And the consequence of what happens if this doesn't happen, right? So 80% of students rely on this. So without this program, they won't be able to eat lunch. So it's very basic, but presents very clearly what the argument is and why it's important. School lunch is the only option. And then it goes into a few other details, which are the font is smaller. And then also has a contact info, which is important. So a lot of times they might actually call you later and want to talk more about the issue. So this is a good example of something very simple. Again, what you're asking for, how they should do it, what data supports it, and where they can contact you for more. And that's really all it is. Oops, sorry. So now, what I'd like to do for the last, let's see, maybe 20 minutes or so, practice have one room where we're going to do elevator pitch. The other one, we're going to do the Onepager. I'm going to share the links and go through that a little bit.